what do we need to consider? Next slide, please. It's always exciting saying that, isn't it?
Yeah.
We should be over it by now.
There we go. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, still on the first slide.
There we go. We got it.
Someone has asked if the slides will be shared. Yes, I am happy to share them with the caveat that you will definitely need to have a wee think about how this applies to your own organisation. So it's general things to think about rather than sort of prescriptive books. Much as I would love a book to be written on this subject, it hasn't been. So we are going with this instead. So the first slide, what we will cover today, is anyone else just seeing the cover slide with the pictures, or is everyone else seeing the first slide of what we will cover?
I see what we covered today. Everyone can see that slide?
Yes.
Yeah, all good.
Grand.
We're good.
Okie dokie. So what we will cover today. I think I am saying something slightly different, which is throwing me. Why do we need to know this as leaders for volunteers? Why does it matter to us? Why does it matter to the organisations that we work in and the people that we volunteer with, or the people who volunteer for us? When are volunteers and employees treated the same and when they are not? There are some situations where we need to consider our whole workforce, and there are absolutely some situations where we need to separate the two. So yeah, what do the laws do and don't apply to volunteers? A few watch outs, quick things to think about. Something just to sort of flag to be with. I'm not going to touch on volunteer workers. That is a whole other kettle of fish, and there's a whole lot of ethical considerations. And I'm really conscious, just particularly, that we are seeing people from a whole host of different organizations, lots of different jobs, some national, some really small, hyper-local. So this is going to be a very brief overview, and I am expecting that some of you are going to absolutely be experts in this. It'll be fantastic to hear your opinions at the end. If people have questions, bit of peer learning is always wonderful in these scenarios. So on to the next slide, please. Why does it matter? So to be blunt, to be honest, it stops us getting into hot water, particularly legal hot water. So we are moving into a time of employment laws changing. Those of you who have a little bit more knowledge of employment law will know that there is a whole raft of changes coming up. So having an awareness of where volunteering sits in that will safeguard us as leaders and our organisations. It helps us to make sure that the relationship between the organisation and the volunteers is reciprocal. We need to make sure that everything is based on mutual benefit. And it really, the main thing for me is that it helps us to ensure that volunteers are treated fairly in the eyes of the law, but also in the eyes of each other. Are we treated fairly and equitably? Oh, somebody is saying, is their connection blipping? Let's have a look. Is it just me? Oh dear, it's possible that my connection is not very good. Right. What can we do about this?
Yeah, everyone is saying same, not just you.
Okay. If I try stopping my video, does that help a little bit? Does that increase the bandwidth slightly?
We can.
Am I less glitchy?
Hey. Much better. Okay.
Much better. Okay. I apologise for rural broadband during a rainstorm. I think that may be the problem. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Volunteers are not employees, except for when they are. So thinking about volunteers in the law, I would say there's three main buckets that we need to consider. So our first bucket is on employment law. So employment law, for those of you who are not aware, it's based on case law. This is where a law will be written and then it is tested. So the way that employment courts work is very much sort of testing the boundaries of those laws, testing how we apply them, and that's how we get our sort of best practice in employment law. Most of those tests add that extra weighting, and this is the area that I know the most about, and the area that I specialise in is employment law and how it applies to a workforce in general. Employment laws don't apply to volunteers. Volunteers are not employees, as we all know. So that's why it doesn't apply to volunteers. But there are other things that we need to consider and other areas of the law where it does. So the next bucket is that law for businesses. And this is something which, in my experience, and sort of certainly in other organisations I've worked for, this is often one of the things that we just don't think about, if we're honest, as volunteer managers and people leading for volunteering. In the National Trust and in other big organisations, it often sits within other teams. So it might sit within operational risk, as it does at the Trust. In a hospice, in another setting, it might be led by the facilities team. But it is really important as volunteer leaders, we have an awareness of it too, because it can impact on us and the volunteering communities that we're supporting and leading for. Talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there's another area that we quite often forget about, and I am calling that the nicely titled other stuff. No, you're right, it wasn't 1794. That was a nice little bit of dyslexia popping in. It's actually 1974. So the 74 Act. Jessica, you're absolutely right. That's my typo. So the other stuff is things that we also need to be aware of. So fundraising. Um, Technically not a law, although there are local laws that touch into fundraising, which I will mention in a minute. Fundraising regulator is someone that I'm pretty sure almost all of us will be registered with as our wider organisations. Again, this tends to sit with the fundraising teams, but it's useful for us to be aware of as volunteering leaders. And I also wanted to touch on the Equalities Act because there are some really unusual quirks when it does apply that will be worth having in the back of your minds. So, next slide, please. So I just want to check because we are doing things slightly unusually because my Zoom is not playing ball. Hopefully we shall have moved into a slide entitled, handily, Employment Laws. So, thank you, Zoe, for giving me the thumbs up. There's some technical joys today, which are always fun to deal with, aren't they? So employment laws, these only apply to volunteers. Only apply to employees, sorry. So we need to make sure that we don't accidentally create an employment relationship. This is the stuff that most volunteer managers will do on a daily basis. It will be the default. And for most of us, it will be so ingrained in our work that we won't really be thinking about it. Does anybody have any suggestions of things? And I was not expecting this many people on the call, so maybe it can sort of go into the chat rather than shouting out, of things that we do on a daily basis to make sure that we're not accidentally creating that that employee and employment relationship. Any sort of quick thoughts and suggestions? Just trying to keep an eye on the chat here. Oh, using correct language. Ollie, that is words that bring me a lot of joy. Um, ooh, interesting. Letting people off easily when they let you down. Do you mean in terms of, yeah, that is one of the joys of volunteering, is there needs to be a lot more flexibility. Clear boundaries, volunteer specific policies. Oh, this is marvelous. And this is the stuff that, almost all of you will know this as bread and butter. This is the basics of volunteer management. So informal language, clear boundaries, policies, agreements, etc. So I've put up here a starter for 10. And you've touched on a lot of this already. Volunteer agreements instead of contracts. I'm sure all of you will have an understanding of that importance of creating an agreement culture rather than a contractual culture. We use role descriptions and not job descriptions. I think it's really common when organisations, particularly really small ones, are moving towards engaging with volunteers. I'm sure a lot of us will have seen that we sort of do a lift and shift, and we change it to change the language from the member of staff to the volunteer. But actually, there needs to be a real shift around what is in those role descriptions. Flexibility around time, somebody mentioned that. In the chat, offering people more flexibility with their time. Expenses, making sure that people are only ever out of pocket. We should never be providing a lump sum. There was a case a few years ago with a Citizens Advice Bureau where they were giving people a flat rate for their transport of, I think it was something like £10 a day.
Oh.
But some people were walking in and didn't claim that at all.
You want a
So,
drink? Yeah,
oh,
no.
hello. Oh, sorry, I think someone's come off mute. I wasn't sure if there was a question. So in that sort of situation, they ended up having to justify that, and they lost a court case because somebody had argued that it was a minimum wage situation correctly in the eyes of the courts. Different processes for staff. So we don't do grievance or sickness management in the trust. We have different approaches. So what we would call a grievance situation for staff is an issue resolution process for volunteers. Some really good examples of titles: volunteer problem solving policies, raising concern policies, problem solving. Yeah, I think a lot of us have variations on a theme of problem solving and issue solving as the name of our equivalency of a grievance. And we would call things a supportive conversation rather than sickness management conversations. So that's really important for two reasons. Partly because something that happens occasionally when people are less experienced in volunteer management is that they will, with the best of intentions, accidentally start using a grievance process. And the grievance process in law is a really defined process. So there's certain things that you absolutely need to do as an employer, and that can create an employment contract if we accidentally go down that route. But also in terms of sickness management versus a supportive conversation, again, we want volunteers to feel like they can be open with us. There needs to be that mutually beneficial relationship. There's a really interesting case that might be of interest to some people. 2024, so it's about a year ago that it came through the employment law courts. It will have had about a 2-year lead time, just because these things take ages, unfortunately. A volunteer sued the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. He said that they had breached employment law by not allowing him to bring a colleague to a disciplinary meeting. And this is back to where having those different terminologies and slightly different approaches is really important. So he said that because of the disciplinary meeting and because of the services he provided, he should be treated as a worker and he should be back paid minimum wage. The first thing the tribunal needed to work out was whether there was a clear difference between the way that the agency treats their staff and treats their volunteers. They argued that there was a very clear difference, that there was a difference in the staff and volunteer handbooks. He'd been given a volunteer one. He had a lot more flexibility than staffs working in the team alongside him did. His volunteer agreement was significantly different to the contracts, and the process for managing his issues was significantly different to the legally required staff grievance process. So the case was thrown out by the courts on the first day. They said, we do not have an employment relationship between this person and the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, so employment law does not apply. Therefore, he was not an employee. So it's really useful for us as volunteering leads because we finally got an example in employment case law where we can point to these things and go, this has been tested. This is why we need to do it. This is why it's really important for us. Next slide, please. Laws for businesses. So as I say, laws for businesses, these are largely around health and safety. So if your company has paid staff, the law applies to volunteers too. So any organisation that has paid staff has a duty of care to all workers. would I be able to just sort of I will respond to some of the questions in the chat when we get to them, because I'm getting distracted already. That is a tendency for me. So I will come back to the chat afterwards, if that's all right with people. So if you're this has been tested in law again. If you are an entirely volunteer run organization, then there is not a need for health and safety legislations to apply. But if you do have employees, then it applies to both. And this, I think, is where volunteer managers quite often are outside in bigger organisations of the volunteer recruitment process. So, as sort of central leads for volunteering, we might be involved in the role descriptions, we might write the volunteer agreements, etc. But the day-to-day management, we still need to be involved in that health and safety. So, this is where things like risk assessments come in. It's making sure that our volunteers have proper training, but only training that is relevant to that role. Because if we send someone on a course as something that is not relevant to that role, it could be seen to have a financial implication. We need to make sure that all our volunteers have PPE. We need to make sure that we've done driver checks to make sure that they are safe, especially if they're driving on our behalf, particularly for things like befriending volunteers. That would be a really good example. I used to run a befriending service, and driver checks and car maintenance checks was a huge part of our active ongoing volunteer risk assessments and risk mitigation. And I've given a couple of examples here in the next bit. I'm going to click on Mushka, of some examples where things which may feel obvious when you think about it and when you've done the risk assessment, we need to consider. So, archaeology volunteers, you need steel toe capped boots. A few years ago, I was working on an archaeology project. I did a risk assessment for the role. We had people moving basically enormous pieces of stone around the site, doing measurements of them, that sort of thing. One of the things that I realised is doing a risk assessment for steel-toed capped boots and being able to buy them was really difficult, because almost everywhere that I could find as a supplier didn't do them any smaller than a UK women's 4, which meant that I couldn't get youth groups in because I couldn't buy the appropriate PPE for them. So that was a sort of an example of actually having done my risk assessment, having thought about the health and safety laws, meant that I had to have conversations with my colleagues about, no, we can't do that. We can't mitigate those risks. Befriending, lone working is something that often comes up in befriending services. How can we mitigate those? And food bank delivery. A lot of people who volunteers with food banks will use the food bank vehicle to drive around supermarkets picking things up. And for sort of somebody saying they can't see the last line on the slide, the last line on the slide says volunteer managers can teach staff managers about this too. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of volunteer managers get really, really good at, in terms of we do our risk assessments as standard, and we get really good at having those difficult conversations about things that need to be implemented to support our volunteers. But I wanted to give you another example. In a previous career, I was a support worker. So I worked for a very large organisation running support work services across my county. A lot of the stuff that we did was lone working, particularly at night. If our clients wanted us to go and visit their family, it would often be after working hours. I didn't feel particularly safe moving into that job, and I didn't feel like the risks had been considered. And one of the things that I was really conscious of was that that was completely different to the volunteering that I was doing at the time, delivering food bank parcels to people who couldn't collect them in person. So in my food bank volunteering, I was in a pair. We had a branded vehicle, so we weren't using our own vehicles. And we had a referral form which had risks on it. So we knew that there might be a dog. We knew that we might have to carry things up 4 flights of stairs. And I was in a really unusual situation where I was able to use the really good practice that was happening in my volunteer management that wasn't happening in my staff job. So it's just an example of how volunteering leadership can really encourage that thought for staff leadership, for example. Somebody just put in the chat, they wonder where the line is for volunteer coordinator responsibilities. You don't write the policies, but you look after the role descriptions in recruitment. I think that's something that is really common in terms of the line being blurred around these things. And I would suggest that whoever is writing the risk assessment for those roles should also be responsible for highlighting the health and safety that sits within it. In terms of a horrendous worst case scenario, it will the person who has written the risk assessment and signed that off, that will be the person that needs to defend themselves if anything goes wrong, which is a really unpleasant way of thinking about it. But sometimes it can be the easiest way to waft a piece of paper at somebody and say, no, this is why we need to do it. And there are some fantastic examples on the Health and Safety Executive of how those processes work in terms of both the civil and non-civil legislative cases rather, around laws for business. So on to the next slide, please. And this is the one I have handily called the other stuff. And this is the stuff which I think is really useful to bear in mind, because it is something that is worth knowing about. It's something that I have had quite a few conversations about recently. And fundraising is the first example of that. So the regulator technically is not a legal entity. Most charities will be signed up to the fundraising regulator, and the regulator expects organisations to adhere to principles. Those principles are fantastically well written, in my opinion. As someone who is only sort of tangibly involved in fundraising, I found them really useful. And there is a new series of them being published in November, which are up on the website now for the funding regulator. They provide principles, and if we don't adhere to those principles, then we can be struck off. So although it's not technically a legal thing, it is a really good practice thing for us to be aware of. But I also had a really interesting conversation recently about fundraising, which I wanted to flag with you because I thought it was some really good learning that I'd experienced. So we had somebody who wanted to volunteer every Saturday in our secondhand bookshops. So the Trust has a secondhand bookshop at almost every one of our built property sites. They do a huge amount of fundraising income generation for us. And this young person wanted to come for 12 weeks as part of his Duke of Edinburgh Award. He was still at school, so he was legally a child. And one of the things I had a fascinating conversation about with our children, young people lead is that a lot of local authorities won't allow this. So they will allow for people to volunteer, but for example, I've given an example here of Baines Council. So I live in Bath, so this is my local council. So if you offer to wash a car or you do odd jobs to raise money for a charity, it doesn't count as employment. What they are incredibly strict on is that doing regular money raising activities counts as employment in the eyes of the council. So each council is responsible for issuing work permits for people who are of school age or preschool leaving age. And it seems like this is something which some councils are really strict on in terms of fundraising and others are not. So a one-off backpacking in a supermarket would not count as it, but we discovered that both in my local authority and in other local authorities, it absolutely does. Somebody saying, what is the definition of regular? Well, that's the question, and that would be up for your local authority to decide. I can see a couple of people saying that they don't allow under 18s, and I think that is increasingly in common, but it is absolutely something that is worth checking, particularly if that person will be handling money and doing something involving fundraising. That's just a watch out there for people to be aware of. There is a little bit more on the bottom of this slide. If you could click again, Mushka, that would be brilliant. So the other thing that I wanted to flag is the Equalities Act. So the Equalities Act is something that comes up a lot in conversation. So the Equalities Act 2010, they don't apply to volunteers because the Equalities Act only applies to, and it's really explicit, it applies to staff and to people receiving services, which isn't typically what we would consider a volunteer. So we don't have an obligation as volunteer involving organisations to provide reasonable adjustments, which is often a great relief when I'm speaking to people who are looking after 18th century buildings. So people aren't seeing the additional bit on the slide. Mushka, could you click again? There's just a sentence at the bottom about the Equalities Act. It literally just says Equalities Act does not apply to volunteers, but it does apply to people who use the services. So that bit about people who are using services is the other part that I thought was really key to flag. So to give you an example, I volunteer for a local charity. They are a service providing organisation. They provide a service on behalf of the local authority on a city farm. So we provide a DBS regulated activity and we are given money by our local authority to deliver that. So although people are there voluntarily, it is volunteering. We need to adhere to the Equalities Act with those people who are volunteering because of that service provision. Likewise, if volunteers are the ones providing a service, so back to befriending is the prime example here, if they are befriending, if they are perhaps working in hospice, or if they are volunteering with a regulated activity, they need to adhere to it too in the way they deliver that service. So it's something that is quite tricky to explain to people, but it's worth being aware of. I want to say regular common or garden volunteer. That's not quite what I mean. But for the vast majority of volunteers, this will not apply. But anyone who is delivering regulated activity and uses volunteers or engages volunteers in that activity will need to be aware of the requirements of the Equalities Act. So on to my final slide, and then I will stop talking at you, and hopefully there will be some points of conversation. What is a regulated activity? So regulated activity is something which is a definition provided by a DBS service. So the DBS service will provide, they've got a wonderful flowchart that helps you work out whether or not something is a regulated activity. Generally, that means that you are providing a service on behalf of a third party when we're talking about charities. So my example of the farm, it's a regulated activity to provide a service for people who are recovering from drug and alcohol addictions because they are seen as vulnerable in the eyes of the DBS services, and it is a regulated activity. So everybody that works and volunteers to deliver that service needs a DBS check. The DBS call centre are fantastically helpful at helping people work out what is and what isn't regulated activity. Someone else put youth work, perfect example. So a watch out on job substitution, which is something that I have a lot of conversations around. It's been really tricky to squish this onto one slide. So if anyone would like more detailed information about job substitution, feel free to email me. I do have a pack that I put together for the National Trust, but that in itself, yes, PVG Scotland, thank you so much. I am really aware that this is a 12-page pack for the National Trust, so I've tried to squish it into one at the end just to kind of flag it, and I'm happy to send people more information if it's useful. There is no legal definition of job substitution. So this is a prime example of that grey area that we deal with as leaders for volunteering. It's broadly considered to be when volunteers replace paid members of staff, and that is usually through a job displacement or a job replacement situation. So job displacement is when paid roles are deliberately ended or removed from a structure with the intention that volunteers will come in and do that instead. So for example, it could be that a receptionist position in an organisation is closed, that position is made redundant, and instead there are 2 volunteers who come in alternating days and they are undertaking exactly the same work instead. That would be a prime example of a job displacement situation. Job replacement is slightly different. If work that has previously been done by paid roles is reallocated to volunteers and the service continues to be delivered but in a really different way. So an example of that could be a museum that has an education provision. It might be that you had an education officer. That post has lost its external funding from the local council. So you think, right, we're going to get volunteers to do specifically school tours. The rest of the work will be absorbed by the curatorial team. That could be a job replacement situation where volunteers are doing certain parts of that job, but the service is being delivered very differently. Those things can open an organisation up to claims of breaches of minimum wage. If they're doing something that someone has previously been paid to do, or if the staff member could use the volunteers as evidence that actually their job still needs to be there, that job still needs to be done, then that can quite often be seen as an unfair redundancy situation and can lead to constructive or unfair dismissal cases. Advice, just some quick top tips. Never do a like-for-like replacement is the easiest way to avoid this. Can volunteers supplement in a way that enables a job to continue, or is there a member of staff that can take on the lead responsibilities that volunteers then supplement the additional benefits to that role? In a job replacement situation where work is being reallocated, if volunteers are picking things up, there needs really careful management to ensure that they're being supported by a member of staff. And that they have flexibility when they come and do something. So, for example, you might move from having a 5-day-a-week paid gardener to having a Tuesday volunteering group rather than one individual coming in every single day. So that would be a really good job replacement situation where something's being done differently. Thing that I am having a lot of conversations around in the moment, I'm really conscious a lot of organisations are restructuring. So many of us are passionate in charities about the work we deliver. If people want to volunteer somewhere that they've previously worked, my advice is always to encourage them to do so in a really different area. So they might have been an IT manager. They can absolutely come and volunteer with us as a visitor welcome assistant at a property, or they might be really interested in volunteering in the conservation team instead. So there's significant difference to what they were previously paid to do. So that is my slightly over my 30 minutes, but that is my 34-minute whistle-stop tour of things to think about in terms of the law and volunteering. I can see a lot of questions coming in to the chat. So Mushka, I'm going to go over to you and your wisdom in terms of what the best way to go in with answering these would
Thank you so
be.
much. Firstly, thank you so much for that, Gwen. Like my mind is blown with a lot of them, and I'm like, oh my God, when I was a volunteer manager, I might have done. I didn't know, and I think that's why it's so important that we're starting this conversation because so many people are just like, I mean, there's so many hats we're wearing as volunteer managers. And there's just
Absolutely, yeah.
another thing to add on that, like, did you know the law? So let's start with in-person questions because Sean, you've got your hand up, so I'm more inclined, and then I'll go through the chat box. If you want to put your question in, I'll go through the chat. But Sean, do you want
Marvelous.
to take us away and start with the Q&A?
Okay. Two things actually that emerge from your fantastic coverage of this. You mentioned in the slides about, I'm talking about the thing that I get quite involved in is the
Mm.
disputes between volunteers or disputes between the volunteer and the organisation they're volunteering for.
Oh, yep.
And you also you talked about like the various procedures that people have. But am
Mm.
I right in thinking that those things, like for example, the sort of dispute resolutions and things like that, they're actually only sort of working practices, they're not necessarily required under law for volunteers.
Yes. In short,
Yeah,
yes, they are best practice. They are something that would be I would say it's best practice in volunteer management,
yes, yeah,
particularly
I agree, I agree.
reputationally, all that
Yeah,
sort of thing. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The employment law would cover the need for all organisations should have a standardised approach for their staff, which is
yeah,
based in the law. There isn't a standardised approach for
no,
volunteering. So
no,
yeah, I think it's a really interesting one because I think organisations, in my experience, have a tendency to go extremely one way or extremely the other,
mm,
where
mm.
people will go, "Oh, this person's causing a problem. Let's get rid of them right away." And actually, they could have some really valid learning for us. There could be something where we do actually have, yeah, maybe they've got some points.
That tends
Um,
to be where I come in, is where somebody, say, might have been volunteering for an organisation for quite a few decades, and all of a sudden the organisation just says goodbye, and you go, well,
eh,
what about a sort of appeals procedure? What about a complaints procedure? Or
yeah,
what about that? And they go, we haven't got one. Goodbye.
I
Um,
think that's really common, particularly in much smaller organisations, unfortunately.
and in larger ones as well. But anyway, thank you for
Ah,
clearing that up. The reason I asked that also as well was because in my paid job, I manage a team of volunteers, and we did have a situation where we were sort of in a bit of a dispute with the volunteer. And although I'm a paid manager and I was dealing with this volunteer, my then line manager said, "Oh, this will need to go to HR," and I'm going, "Why?" If it's for a,
mhm.
if it's a volunteer, between a volunteer and a manager, it should be somewhere different. But anyway, thank you for clearing that up. The other thing I
No
just
worries.
very briefly want to talk about as well is, you talked about earlier about expenses and remuneration.
Mm,
Now, I volunteered a few years ago for a wonderful thing called the Floating Cinema Project, where
mhm.
they put a cinema on a boat and then floated it around the rivers and showed people films in open air.
Oh, that sounds
And
great.
I used to get a £12 travel allowance, regardless of whether I used it or not.
Mhm.
And of course, I did question the legality of that, because I didn't actually, I didn't have to present any receipts for it. It was, you did the shift and you got your
Ooh.
£12. But also, as well, in other organisations I've volunteered for, people get certain privileges. For example, on a youth centre I worked on, they got free parking of their caravans, or they got to use the boats on a sea, on a sea scout camp and things like that.
Mhm.
Now, that to me strikes me as a bit tricky in terms of, like, does that count as payment?
It's
You
a
know what
really
I
good
mean?
question. Um, so there is a whole untested area in terms of payment, what counts as payment for volunteers and what doesn't count as payment for volunteers. And I think a lot of us would be absolutely terrified if we found out that something like that was going through a court. Um, so a lot of it, uh, sort of being vague in my answer, but one of the things that I would ask is it consistent? Is it to all volunteers?
Mhm.
Um, is it something which is done according to the number of hours or the number of shifts? And actually, is it discretionary? And I
Mm.
think the main thing for me is that anything given needs to be discretionary. So
Yeah.
inviting volunteers to uh, the opening of I was just thinking, yeah, so I went to the opening of an exhibition with a family member who's a volunteer the other week, and it was lovely. It was something that all volunteers were invited to, regardless of how many hours they deliver. I think one
Mhm.
of the things that potentially gets tricky is when you say, if you do this many, we will give you this, which has a cash
Yeah.
equivalency, because you're essentially saying, if you do this many hours, we will give you this much instead of paying you.
Mm.
But it very much depends on the setup of your organization. Do you give staff the same thing?
Mm.
If you give staff the same thing, you're less likely to be given a payment in kind to volunteers. It is deeply complicated and it will very much depend on each organization's setup. That's really vague and annoying. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, no, I know, you're right. You're right. It's the whole thing about the benefit in kind. You know, my current job, for example, where I manage volunteers, they get to watch the shows as part of that role. But if we then said to them, well, if you volunteer for 3 shows, you'll get a free ticket of 4th show, that becomes a benefit in kind.
Absolutely, great example. And I would assume most of the staff that were there would be able to watch it as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
But as I said, you have also seen things like, say, working on scout camp, people were allowed to park their caravans there for free, or as I say, in a Sea Scout place where the volunteers were able to take the boats out when they're not being used by the kids for boating holidays and things like that.
Mm.
I'm just going to cut you off there just because
Right,
I'm
fine, thank you,
time.
enough.
I do apologise. Thank you so much
Yes,
for those thoughtful questions. One question that's gone in the chat, and then I'll come to you, Fiona. This is super. Any thoughts on having volunteers sign volunteer agreements? Is this moving into contract territory?
So this is personal opinion for me, but I think it depends on what your volunteer agreement and what your employment contract say. So, and I also think it depends why you're asking them to sign it. So if you're asking them to sign it because there might be, for example, references to working with vulnerable people, or if there are references to keeping confidentiality of vulnerable people, and that is something that you need to say to an external funder, to your local authority, you need to be absolutely sure that you're doing as much as you can to safeguard people, then I think that's all right. If you're getting somebody who is coming to do some gardening once in a blue moon, I would be saying, what is the advantage of getting that signature on that volunteer agreement? I don't think that signing something in itself inherently means that it's a contract, particularly if you say something along the lines of, I am signing this in acknowledgement that I have received the volunteer agreement and my volunteer handbook and will adhere to the policies within it. I don't think there's a problem with that at all. If your volunteer agreement said, I will come every Tuesday at 10 in the morning and I won't leave before 4:30, that's when you would have the issues with it becoming the employment contract.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Fiona, do you want to go ahead? Oh, you're on mute. Fiona? Fiona, we can't hear you. Was that just me? I can't hear you.
No, me either, I'm afraid.
Do you have like if should I go to Caroline in the meantime? Yeah.
Cool.
Caroline.
Oh.
Almost, yeah. Hi.
Hey.
A couple. One was speaking about people who've done roles and are now volunteering. So we've got someone who retired last year in a role, had trained someone up to move into a place who has done, but now she's come back to volunteer in that role. Is that a problem because it's the same role she used to do, but she's not getting paid for it now? Like, is having a volunteer agreement enough, even though it's the exact same role she used to do and get paid for?
If it's exactly the same role, my questions would be around how have you made sure that the role description and the job description are sufficiently different? Would she be able to test it and say, hang on a minute, 18 months ago I was being paid for this and now I'm not? Because that's where your breach of minimum wage act will come in. Ooh. If she can demonstrate that there is significant similarity between the role that she used to be paid to do and the role she is volunteering in now, you run the risk of opening yourselves up to a minimum wage breach. And I think that is the sort of the difficulty of that is it's almost defaulting to that worst case scenario. You could very easily end up in a situation where you have a second job being advertised in that, and the person's going, oh, hang on, I've been doing this. Why have I not been paid for it? If you are advertising a second job to do exactly what I've been volunteering in. Okay. So I think that's kind of where I would urge caution, really.
Okay. And could I just ask also on the Equalities Act, you said you don't have to provide reasonable adjustment. Obviously, we like to be an inclusive.
Oh, absolutely. You can do it if you want to. And it's brilliant that we do, but legally you don't have to.
So would you say avoid doing like the forms if they, I'm sorry, like the DSE form, because that's too rigid and staff-like? Is it do it for them, but don't record it like you would for a staff member?
So DSE is different because it's not about Equalities Act. It's not about employment law. It's everybody in the business. So it's covered in that second pot of the business stuff. And that's the stuff that applies. And this is where it's tricky, right? Because DSE and health and safety stuff is an everyone in the organisation thing.
Okay.
But that's a really good example of where it gets complicated.
I just know there's like so many questions that we can't get
So
through.
many. I'm
So
really
what-
sorry I can't answer
I
them
know.
all.
So what I have a suggestion is we've made a volunteer managers group on LinkedIn and we have one on Facebook, but let's keep this one to LinkedIn. I'll post, Gwen, you're on LinkedIn, aren't you? That's how
I am on LinkedIn, yeah.
If I add you to the group and we'll do just like a main post where everyone asks the question, because it's actually what's really happening now in our chat on Zoom, which is really nice, is other people from other
Oh, I
organizations
love that, yeah.
answering questions. So I'm just
Yes.
going to pop the link. We'll still keep going, but I just wanted to keep everyone aware. So if anyone wants to join that LinkedIn group, I'll approve them. And then I'll do a main post and everyone asks their questions underneath, because I don't want anyone going out of this being like, oh, I have this question still. So does anyone have any other questions? If not, I'll go to the chat. My Zoom has gone really weird. I don't know what's going on. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask, or okay, we asked about that.
No.
Yeah.
Oh,
Fiona?
can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I had a very quick question. National insurance number. Where do we sit on that legally? Do we have to ask for it? Because it's quite a contention point where I work.
Gwen, do you know that?
I can't find it anywhere.
Oh, Gwen, you still with us? Oh,
Oh,
let's see. Does anyone know the answer for that? I think
someone's just put driver checks. No other reason. We don't use driver's checks. We only have people working with our adults. It is quite a difficult one, isn't it? I can't seem to find in our legal department. It's not very sure about it either. It makes me feel quite uncomfortable, but if it is the law, I'd be happy to ask for it.
Okay, I think Gwen's dropped off.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Hi, Gwen.
Screen bigger and closed Zoom. I'm not very familiar. No apologies.
You asked the question about NI numbers, if they need to take NI, if you're allowed to capture NI numbers, is that what it is, or ask for it?
I don't want to. My HR has asked.
I don't understand why you would need one.
Yeah.
This is my question to HR. Oh, they say it because we have to.
Well,
if legally, I'd like
to be blunt,
have a case. Sorry.
Yeah, to be blunt, they're wrong. So I don't know what. So I feel like I should caveat that I work in a HR team. I'm kind of dual qualified. I can't think of a situation where I would need to know somebody's national insurance number to know that they were eligible to volunteer with us. We should absolutely not be collecting any form of personal identifiable information without legitimate processing reason. The only thing that I can think of is that maybe they're seeing it of a right to work check, but you can have a national insurance number without having the legal right to work. They're not the same thing. Yeah.
It is for right to work mainly. Thank you.
Zoe made a good point about basic rule of GDPR, as if you don't collect it if you don't need it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be it for me.
Yeah.
I can't think of a reason you would need it, and it doesn't demonstrate that someone has the right to work and volunteer in the UK. For example, students will quite often have a national insurance number, but they might not have the right to work or volunteer in the UK according to their visa.
Great, thank you. Louise, do you have a question for Gwen? And welcome back. How long have you been back?
Thank you.
You were on mat leave, weren't you?
Oh,
yes, wow. I returned on Tuesday last week, and I'm doing 2 days a week. So,
well, thanks.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Thank you. Yeah, I just thought it would be good to refresh myself on some of the things like DBS and the law and all of this. So yeah, it's really good to be here. I do have a question. As you can imagine, I've returned from maternity leave and my workload is large. So I have been considering sourcing a volunteer to help me with some of the admin tasks, such as screening and adding data to a spreadsheet that just takes up so much of my time, so that I can focus on more proactive things. And it does beg the question, can that be a volunteer role in the eyes of the law, since they're going to be potentially doing some of my tasks? Or could that still be considered a volunteer because they're essentially just coming to help me with some of my day-to-day?
Ooh, so this would be a it depends type answer. So apologies, I've turned my video off again because I don't want to be glitching. One of the things that I would ask is, are you doing the same days and hours that you did before you went on maternity leave? And is anyone covering that gap in that delivery?
So I am doing the same hours, although I am phasing back in. And somebody was covering me until the summer, when they then also went on maternity leave. So there's actually been a few months gap where nobody's been covering my role.
So if you are doing the same hours and the job you've come back to is the same, then theoretically there shouldn't be an issue with that. If you had come back to, say, 3 days a week when you previously did 4, and you were struggling to fit that in, that's where I would have concerns if someone in my organisation was asking me. And I just want to say, I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, etc. This is very much my opinion. But if somebody was asking me, that would be where my concern would be.
Right.
Because
I am doing 2 days a week, using my annual leave to shorten my hours. So I'm contracted to do the same 24 hours. I'm just using my leave to shorten my week for now.
If you are contracted to and will be returning to, then a volunteer will be adding benefit to your role when you come back to your full hours. If you were doing 2 days a week and there was no plans to mitigate that 2 day a week loss, then that for me would be a job substitution issue.
That's brilliant. That answers that for me. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. And welcome back to work. Good luck with balancing everything.
Thanks.
Many of our volunteer roles are to assist staff to ease their pressures. Is that a problem? People keep asking about the right to work checks, and Daniel's put on something quite good in the chat.
Yeah, right to work is really complicated. I would agree with Daniel. Generally, it's not required. There's about 35 different types of visa, so it's an entire realm of its own. Each visa will have stipulations of whether people have the right to work and volunteer or not. Volunteering is very, very rarely mentioned on a visa unless they have a volunteer specific visa. A lot of that is down to organisational appetite for risk mitigation as much as anything. But yeah, if you have so if people are on a tourist visa, then they shouldn't be volunteering as their main purpose for being in the country. It's that sort of stuff is where it gets complicated. But I will be completely honest with you, and this is where it's tricky, because we don't have the capacity to check that. Feel free to I've just seen something about feel free to add me on LinkedIn. But yeah, it is always a good idea to check it, because we are mitigating any risk to ourselves that somebody is not in the country illegally, and it's a horrible thing to have to do. But yeah, it prevents you being opened up to other checks. But when I spoke to our employment lawyer about it, he said, we don't know, it's never been tested in court, which is always a fun way to mitigate a risk. So
be the guinea pig for that,
yeah.
Also, we had a couple comments about you mentioned the job substitution booklet that you did for the National Trust.
Yeah, I'm really happy to share that. Obviously with the caveat that it was written for a National Trust audience, but you're very welcome to ping me a message on LinkedIn.
I'm happy to share it in our follow-up if you want to share it with me, Gwen.
Cool.
And I'll share it with our follow-up. Is that okay?
Yep, I will do a bit of frantic editing of it if it's going wider. From a purely practical point of view, we tend to kind of record who we're sending things to. But yeah, I'm happy. Sorry.
I'm happy then to copy you into the follow-up email.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Who wants to respond to you?
Brilliant. Let's do it that way, and then people can get in touch.
Probably easier than blankly emailing it out.
Thank you.
I'm conscious of time. As I said, I will. I've already seen a lot of requests to join our LinkedIn group. On that LinkedIn group, Gwen, I'm going to tag you and other people in the chat and just say, feel free to ask us anything, and then hopefully we can all bounce off from each other. But this is what I love about the volunteer managers community, is everyone helping each other out, learning from each other, especially from big
Totally.
organizations like you, Gwen. So really appreciate your time. Sorry we didn't get to do any networking or any
I
great
know, I feel like I've talked too much. I'm so sorry,
No,
everybody.
brilliant. No, it's a good sign, Gwen. It's a good sign. So yeah, thank you so much for all the hard work you've done in preparing for this and for all your knowledge. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining. So yeah, thank you so much and see you at the next
No
one.
worries. Lovely to meet you all. See you
Thank you,
soon.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.